The HOA Karen ignored my warnings until the flood came. I'm so glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story of revenge from. I want to know how far it has reached. When I first arrived in this neighborhood, I believed I had finally found peace. Every lawn looked like it had been combed by hand, the pastel houses shimmered under the morning light, and every woman smiled as if life itself was a competition in charm. For a brief moment, I thought I could belong among them. That illusion vanished the day I met Linda, the HOA president. She carried her authority like a crown, polished and heavy, with a smile that felt rehearsed. She inspected my home with the precision of a customs officer. Her gaze lingered on my yellow mailbox, and she announced that it violated the community's aesthetic rules. I laughed politely, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. That was the day I learned that peace here came with a price tag. At first, I tried to play along. I repainted the fence to her liking, replaced the curtains she claimed were too loud, and kept my dog indoors. I thought compliance would bring quiet. But Linda didn't want quiet. She wanted control. Every week, I found a new notice in my mailbox. Unapproved plant type. Incorrect garbage bin placement. Unauthorized garden ornament. It became a routine of humiliation wrapped in paperwork. The neighborhood began to change. People who once waved from across the street now avoided eye contact, afraid of becoming her next target. I became the cautionary tale whispered at the monthly gatherings. Still, I stayed polite. I even baked cookies once, wrapped them in gold paper, and brought them to her door as a peace offering. She thanked me with that same perfect smile, and the next morning, I received another fine. Overgrown plants this time. I stared at the notice in disbelief and felt something inside me tighten. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about her reminding me that she had power, and I didn't. That night, I stopped baking. Months passed, and construction began on new houses near the old retention dam behind the community. It was an area I knew well. Before retirement, I had worked in civil engineering, and I could tell something was wrong. Cracks had formed near the base, faint but spreading. The soil was shifting unevenly. Every rainfall made it worse. I warned Linda. I even prepared a report with photos and diagrams, hoping she would see reason. At the next HOA meeting, I stood up and explained the risks. The room fell silent for a moment before she spoke. She smiled and said that the HOA had everything under control. Then the laughter began. I left that meeting with my head down, my warnings dismissed as paranoia. Weeks later, I saw the first storm clouds forming. Thick grey walls of water moved slowly across the horizon, heavy with the promise of destruction. I could feel the electricity in the air, smell the tension of rain waiting to fall. I emailed Linda one last time, urging her to inspect the dam before the storm hit. She never replied. When I called, she didn't answer. The wind picked up, rattling my windows, and I watched from my porch as the first drops began to fall. Small puddles grew into streams. The sound of thunder rolled through the night like a warning drum. By midnight, the storm was raging. I put on my yellow raincoat, grabbed my flashlight, and drove to the dam. The headlights sliced through the rain, illuminating the overflowing water. The gate trembled under the pressure, metal moaning against the force. I didn't touch it at first. I just stood there, drenched, watching the water rise higher and higher until it spilled over. Nature was doing what I had predicted all along. I didn't cause what happened. I only stopped standing in the way of what was meant to happen. The sound of the flood was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't chaos. It was power. The current tore through the streets, devouring everything in its path. The lawns, the fences, the pastel houses that once looked like paintings of perfection all disappeared beneath the water. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving only silence. The neighborhood was unrecognizable, blanketed in mud and debris. Reporters called it an act of nature. I called it the consequence of arrogance. When they came asking for answers, I handed them my reports, my emails, my photos. They looked through the evidence and nodded solemnly. The HOA was dissolved. Linda resigned. She moved away quietly, leaving behind the ruins of her empire of control. I stayed. I planted new flowers by my mailbox, bright yellow ones, the same color she once said didn't belong. Now, every time it rains, I sit by the window and watch the drops slide down the glass. I no longer fear the storm. It reminds me that nature always finds balance, even when people don't. The HOA ignored my warnings. The flood only reminded them that rules mean nothing when the earth decides to speak. I didn't seek revenge. I simply stopped protecting those who refused to listen. The peace I lost that day came back with the sound of rain. It began quietly, the kind of cruelty that hides behind smiles and paperwork. The first fine arrived in a plain white envelope. $50 for an unapproved flower color. I stared at it in disbelief, holding the notice as if it were a bad joke. I had planted those roses myself, soft pink, delicate, beautiful. The kind that made the morning light shimmer through their petals. But according to Linda, the HOA president, they disrupted the neighborhood's visual harmony. I laughed at first, thinking it was a misunderstanding. It wasn't. The following week came another fine, this time for a non-regulation fence. Apparently, my wooden panels were 2 inches higher than permitted. Every envelope carried her signature, written with a flourish like she was signing a decree. At first, I paid them. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But something about those letters began to feel personal. Every morning, I opened my mailbox with dread, half expecting to see another notice tucked between the bills. It became part of my routine, this silent humiliation. I started to wonder how she had the time to monitor every detail of my home. The color of my doormat. The number of wind chimes hanging on my porch. Even the small bird bath near my mailbox somehow offended her sense of order. I caught her once, standing across the street in her pastel blouse, staring at my house like a hawk studying its prey. She pretended to check her phone when our eyes met, but the message was clear. She was watching me. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself she was simply doing her job. But her job didn't include knocking on my door at 8 in the morning to tell me my garbage bins were placed 3 inches too far from the curb. Her job didn't include inspecting my backyard without permission, claiming she was ensuring compliance. It was no longer about regulations. It was about control. I started to see it in her posture during meetings, the way she leaned back in her chair while everyone else stayed seated upright, as if the whole room existed to serve her. The HOA board followed her every word like obedient shadows, nodding and smiling at everything she said. One evening, I attended a community meeting hoping to confront her publicly. The room smelled of coffee and stale carpet. I stood up and asked why I was being targeted. I expected a debate, maybe even a bit of decency. Instead, she gave me that same perfect smile that never reached her eyes and said in front of everyone that rules exist for a reason and everyone must learn to follow them. The room went quiet, except for a few awkward coughs. I felt small under the weight of her performance, trapped in a place that applauded her control. I sat down without another word, pretending her response hadn't burned through me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my car, listening to the rain, and I cried, not from the fines, but from the realization that she enjoyed it. The fines kept coming. $75 for improper edging on the driveway. $100 for leaving seasonal decorations past the deadline. $200 for unauthorized color changes to the shutters that hadn't even been painted. It was as if she invented reasons to remind me of her power. I kept every notice in a small folder, each one a record of her obsession. I told myself it would stop eventually. It didn't. The emotional weight began to spill into my daily life. I stopped gardening because every new bloom felt like an invitation for punishment. I stopped inviting friends over because I didn't want them to see the notices stacked on my counter like warning labels. My home, once my sanctuary, became a stage where Linda performed her authority. Sometimes I would see her driving slowly past, her car creeping along the curb as if measuring the distance between her superiority and my defiance. Neighbors whispered behind my back, pretending not to notice the tension that filled the air whenever I walked by. Some pitied me, others avoided me, afraid to become her next target. I could feel their silence pressing against me every time I went outside. The isolation was worse than the money I lost. It was the feeling of being erased slowly, one rule at a time. I wanted to fight back, but I didn't yet know how. One afternoon, as I was trimming my hedges, she appeared again, walking briskly toward me with her clipboard. She didn't greet me, didn't even make eye contact. She simply circled something on her form and muttered that my hedge line exceeded community standards. Her voice was calm, measured, dripping with control. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something hollow behind the perfection. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was protecting her ego. The realization struck me like a jolt of electricity. Her entire identity rested on being the one who told others how to live. That night, as I sat by my window staring at the neat row of mailboxes gleaming under the streetlight, I felt a shift inside me. I was done being quiet. I began to collect evidence, not just of her pettiness but of her neglect. Records of ignored maintenance requests, broken drainage systems, and complaints from other residents she conveniently buried. I didn't know what I would do with them yet, but I knew one thing for certain. The next time Linda sent me a fine, I wouldn't cry. I would smile. Because I had finally stopped being her victim and started becoming her consequence. Behind our houses stood the old retention dam, a structure most people barely noticed, but one I watched carefully every time the clouds gathered. It had been built decades ago when the land was still farmland, long before the pastel houses and tidy lawns replaced the open fields. The dam had always done its job, holding back the heavy rains that swept through each spring, but I could tell something had changed. The soil near the base had started to sink unevenly. The concrete surface, once smooth, now bore the faint veins of fatigue. When the wind blew at night, I could hear it moan softly, like a warning whispered through the dark. Most people ignored it, but I had spent years working in civil engineering before I retired, and I knew the language of failing structures. That dam was speaking, and no one wanted to listen. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it. Maybe the cracks were old. Maybe the sound of shifting concrete was just the wind. But the more I watched, the more certain I became. After every storm, the cracks widened, tiny rivers of water trickling through where none should be. The new houses being built nearby only made things worse. Heavy machinery rattled the ground day and night, pressing against a system already straining under its own weight. I documented everything, photographing the changes, logging rainfall levels, and tracing the slow spread of damage across the surface. When I brought it up at an HOA meeting, the room was already tense. Linda sat at the front, her clipboard perfectly aligned with her water bottle, her eyes sharp and condescending. I waited for my turn to speak, clutching the printed reports I had prepared. When I began explaining what I'd seen, the room fell quiet for a moment. A few of the men exchanged glances, and I could see they didn't understand half of what I was saying. Linda smiled in that patient, superior way she always did when she wanted to make someone look foolish. I told them the dam needed reinforcement immediately, that the erosion behind it was progressing faster than expected, and that ignoring it could put the entire lower half of the neighborhood at risk. She crossed her arms and tilted her head, pretending to listen, but her eyes gleamed with amusement. When I finished, she thanked me for my input and said that the board had everything under control. Then she looked around and joked that maybe I should focus on fixing my fence before worrying about infrastructure. The room erupted in polite laughter, the kind that wounds deeper than words. I sat there frozen, my cheeks burning, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. I wanted to shout, to make them see that this wasn't about pride or fences or rules. It was about safety, about consequences. But Linda had a way of making truth sound like hysteria when it came from anyone but her. When the meeting ended, I gathered my papers, trying not to show the tremor in my hands. As I walked out, I heard someone whisper that I had too much free time. Another said that retirement must be getting to me. I didn't look back. I drove home under the heavy clouds, the steering wheel slippery beneath my fingers, and by the time I parked, I was shaking not from embarrassment, but from the quiet rage of being right too soon. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by my window, staring at the dam lights flickering faintly through the rain. I knew what lay beneath that calm surface: pressure building, concrete weakening, water waiting. Nature has patience, but it never forgets. I replayed Linda's smirk in my mind, the way she dismissed me as though my knowledge were nothing compared to her position. It wasn't about the dam to her. It was about winning. about never admitting that someone else might know more. I could almost hear her voice as I closed my eyes, mocking me with that sugary tone she used to keep everyone beneath her thumb. The next morning, I went back to the dam on foot. The air was thick and heavy, the ground still slick from last night's rain. I crouched near the embankment and ran my hand over the fissures. They were deeper than before. The soil smelled of wet clay and decay, and a faint current pulsed under the surface. I knew what it meant: seepage. The beginning of structural failure. I stood there, drenched and furious, and realized that I was the only one who cared enough to notice. The HOA would never act unless someone forced them to. But how do you force arrogance to listen? I tried again a few days later, sending an email with photographs attached. I explained the risks clearly, outlined the timeline, and even cited old maintenance records I had tracked down. Linda replied briefly, thanking me for my concern and assuring me that the matter had been reviewed. I knew that meant nothing. No inspection was ever scheduled. No engineer was ever called. She wanted the problem buried because acknowledging it would mean admitting she had neglected something far more important than a fence or a flowerbed. Weeks passed, and the rains returned heavier than before. Each storm seemed to test the dam's strength a little more. I could feel it through the ground when I walked near the backyards, the faint tremor of water pressing where it shouldn't. The sound of dripping had become constant, echoing at night like a heartbeat in the earth. My neighbors still mowed their lawns, painted their fences, and argued about mailbox sizes while a disaster crept beneath their feet. I tried to warn a few of them, but they smiled awkwardly and said the HOA was handling it. They didn't want to get involved. No one ever does until it's too late. One evening, after another ignored message, I sat alone in my living room listening to the rain. It tapped against the window in steady rhythm, almost soothing, almost cruel. I thought about all the times I had been right in my career, all the buildings I had helped strengthen, all the lives protected because I had spoken up. And here I was, dismissed by a woman who cared more about uniform mailboxes than about safety. I poured myself a glass of wine and stared at the folder of evidence I had collected. The photos, the measurements, the warnings all there, waiting. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting negligence. I was fighting pride. The dam wasn't the only thing cracking in that neighborhood. There was something deeper, something that broke each time someone like Linda laughed at someone like me. Every ignored warning, every public dismissal, every polished lie added weight to the breaking point. I didn't know it yet, but the storm that would come soon would wash away more than houses. It would drown her authority, her arrogance, her power built on shallow ground. Nature doesn't care about titles. And neither did I anymore. Linda's war against me turned from petty to public the moment she realized I would not bend. The fines and warnings were no longer enough for her. She wanted humiliation. She wanted me erased from the picture-perfect story she had built around her rule. It began with whispers, subtle at first, the kind that drifted from yard to yard like wind through dry leaves. By the time I heard the rumors, they had already rooted deep. The neighbors said I was unstable, that I harassed the HOA board, that I spent my days inventing conspiracies about dams and floods because I had nothing better to do. Linda had crafted the narrative so skillfully that even people I once greeted with warmth now avoided my eyes. I would wave to them out of habit, and they would look past me as if I were invisible. The quiet isolation was far crueler than any fine she had ever issued. She didn't stop there. She mailed letters to every household in the neighborhood, stamped with the HOA logo, warning them about what she called disruptive behavior from a concerned resident. She never used my name directly, but everyone knew who she meant. It was elegant, calculated, the kind of defamation that hides behind professionalism. I saw her one morning slipping envelopes into the community mailboxes herself, a small smile on her face as she moved from one to another, completely at ease in her cruelty. By the afternoon, people were already talking. The next time I walked into a store nearby, two women who lived down the street stepped aside to whisper. I could feel their glances pressing against my back like needles. Block parties, once filled with laughter and potluck dishes, went on without me. Invitations that used to come by mail never arrived. Children I used to wave to stopped waving back. When I crossed the street, neighbors pretended to check their phones or turned suddenly toward their gardens. It wasn't just rejection, it was coordinated exile. Linda had turned me into a story everyone could safely hate. I was no longer Karen, the woman who worked in engineering, the neighbor who once helped organize holiday decorations. I was the crazy woman who cried wolf. But even as my social life dissolved, I watched Linda carefully. I watched the way she posed for photographs beside the newly built houses, the ones she had proudly approved near the edge of the dam. Developers loved her. She loved the attention, the image of being the modern visionary expanding the community. Every time a new family moved in, she would arrive at their door with a basket and a smile, posing for pictures under the HOA banner. I saw those photos online. Linda in her pastel suits, pearls shining against her tan skin, the dam glittering faintly behind her like an ornament rather than the ticking clock it had become. She didn't see the cracks forming behind the beauty. Or maybe she did and chose to ignore them. That's the thing about arrogance. It makes people blind to the ground crumbling under their own feet. I still walked by the dam every few days, pretending to be out for exercise. I didn't bring my camera anymore. I didn't take notes. I already had enough proof to fill a courtroom, but what would that change? I had sent emails. I had spoken at meetings. I had warned them. Each effort was met with laughter, dismissal, or a polite suggestion that I find a hobby. It was strange to realize that truth can lose its value when the wrong person speaks it. In Linda's kingdom, image was worth more than reality, and she was very good at building images. The worst part was how easily people accepted her version of me. It didn't take evidence. It didn't take logic. All it took was repetition. She spoke with authority, and authority has a way of sounding like truth even when it is poison. I would overhear conversations in the grocery store, pieces of gossip floating in the air. One man said I had been seen sneaking around the dam with tools at night. Another claimed I had harassed a construction worker. None of it was true, but denial only feeds rumor. Silence became my only defense. I learned to hold my head high, to pretend it didn't sting when people turned away. Linda, on the other hand, thrived in her newfound glory. She hosted luncheons, appeared in community newsletters, and praised herself for transforming the neighborhood into what she called a model of modern living. I watched her acceptance speeches, her photo spreads, her carefully curated perfection, and felt a strange mix of disgust and fascination. She was building her empire on sand, both literally and metaphorically. Beneath the freshly paved streets, water was moving, slow and steady, carving its own path through the weaknesses she ignored. I knew it was only a matter of time before her masterpiece cracked. I wasn't crazy. I was patient. One evening, I saw her standing by the construction site, arms crossed, watching the workers finish the last of the new houses. The sunset cast a warm glow across her face, painting her in gold. She looked powerful, triumphant, unaware that behind her, small rivulets of water seeped through the dam's weakened wall. I almost pitied her in that moment. Almost. Because power has a way of blinding people to warnings they cannot control. She thought my silence meant defeat. It didn't. It meant calculation. I was waiting for the truth to reveal itself in the most undeniable way possible. The next day, as if to mock me, another HOA letter arrived. This one wasn't a fine. It was a notice of an emergency meeting to discuss community image. The phrasing was clear. They wanted to restore trust after certain residents had spread unnecessary fear. My hands trembled as I read it, not from anger, but from something colder. She had not only discredited me, she had made me a symbol of everything she despised. I folded the letter neatly and set it aside. There was nothing more to say. That night, as I stood by my window watching lightning flash over the hills, I felt the same familiar vibration beneath the ground. The storm was coming back, heavier this time. The air smelled metallic, sharp, and full of promise. I pressed my palm against the glass and smiled for the first time in months. Linda's empire was flawless only in the sunlight. Under the weight of rain, everything would show its truth. The dam was tired of being ignored, and so was I. My isolation had become my advantage. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me dangerous. The neighborhood saw a woman beaten by humiliation, but they had no idea that the quiet ones always hear the cracks first. The sky began to darken days before the storm arrived. The air itself felt heavier, charged with the kind of tension that makes even the trees fall silent. Birds stopped gathering on the power lines, and the wind carried a low, uneasy hum through the neighborhood. Every instinct in me recognized the signs. The weather service issued a warning for heavy rainfall, the kind that tests the strength of every structure, the kind that punishes negligence. I could almost hear the dam groaning in anticipation, the water behind it restless like an animal waiting to break free. I sent the first email to the HOA that morning, attaching my latest photos, the ones that showed the cracks spreading like veins across the lower wall. No reply. By noon, I sent another one, then a text, then a call. The phone rang and rang until a voicemail box cut through with a chirpy recording about community unity. My frustration boiled into something sharp and focused. The storm clouds rolled in by the afternoon, stacking over each other like bruises spreading across the sky. When the wind began to howl, I tried one last time. I texted Linda directly, keeping my words simple and factual. I told her the dam would not survive another night of heavy rain. Her response came minutes later. Please stop creating panic. That was it. No concern, no plan, no acknowledgement of the danger. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was denial. The kind that grows when someone believes their title can control nature. I stared at that message for a long time, the glow of my phone lighting my face as the first drops of rain tapped against the window. Something inside me hardened. That was the moment I stopped asking. I moved quietly through the house, packing a small bag with essentials: a flashlight, a raincoat, bottled water, and a thermos of coffee. I wasn't sure what I intended to do, but I knew I couldn't sit by and watch the disaster unfold from my window. The sound of thunder grew louder, rolling through the distance like drums of judgment. I stepped outside, locking the door behind me, and felt the wind whip my hair across my face. The streets were already slick, puddles forming in the gutters. The air smelled like electricity and earth. Every window in the neighborhood was glowing with warm light, families settling inside, trusting that Linda's system would keep them safe. I envied their ignorance for only a second. Then I started the car. Driving through the rain felt like navigating through a nightmare. The wipers struggled to keep up as water blurred the road ahead. I passed the new development, the one Linda had celebrated in every newsletter. The houses stood proud and uniform, their white fences gleaming in the flashes of lightning. But already, water was pooling along the foundations. The ground there had always been too soft, the drainage inadequate. I could see it now: mud rising, grass swallowed whole, sidewalks turning into rivers. Her precious expansion was sinking before the real storm had even arrived. By the time I reached the dam, night had swallowed the horizon. My headlights cut across the slick concrete, revealing the swollen reservoir straining against its limits. The sound was deafening, a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I stepped out of the car, the rain soaking me instantly, and lifted the flashlight. The beam trembled across the cracks, now wide enough for thin streams of water to escape. The dam wasn't just weak, it was dying. Each drop that escaped carried the weight of the years of neglect that Linda and her board had ignored. The water's edge pulsed closer with every passing minute, the reservoir no longer holding but preparing to break. I shouted into the wind as if anyone could hear me, though I knew no one was coming. The HOA office was dark. The board members were probably warm in their homes, sipping tea, unaware that their empire of control was about to be erased. I climbed the small embankment to check the release gate, gripping the cold metal railings for balance. The rain had turned the earth beneath my boots into sludge, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the top, lightning flashed, illuminating the dam and the black water churning behind it. The sight froze me. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, like watching truth itself prepare to reveal what pride had hidden. For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me wondered if I should call again, if maybe someone would finally listen. But then I thought of all the ignored messages, all the laughter, all the quiet humiliation of being dismissed again and again. I realized that even if I screamed until my voice broke, they would still call it hysteria. The only language they ever understood was consequence. And nature was fluent in it. I walked along the edge, feeling the vibration through the soles of my boots, the living pulse of water pushing harder and harder. When the first breach came, it wasn't loud. It started as a soft crack, a sigh of surrender, then a roar that ripped through the storm like a beast unleashed. Water gushed through the fracture, wild and unstoppable. I stumbled back, shielding my face from the spray, my flashlight falling into the mud. The sound grew, the ground trembling as the wall began to give way piece by piece. The rain intensified, blurring the world into streaks of motion and sound. I stood there, soaked and shaking, watching as the flood began its descent toward the neighborhood. It wasn't vengeance that filled me, it was something quieter. A sense of inevitability. I turned toward the car, my clothes clinging to my skin, my hair plastered to my face. The road ahead glimmered under the storm's fury. Behind me, the dam continued to collapse, releasing years of warning in a single surge. I drove slowly back, my headlights reflecting off the rushing water that now followed the path of the streets. It twisted through the new development like a river reclaiming its course. Fences cracked, lights flickered, alarms began to scream in the distance. Linda's perfect kingdom was dissolving under the truth she refused to face. As I passed the main road, I saw her house standing tall at the top of the hill, untouched for now. I imagined her sitting by the window, reading her emails, unaware that the empire she had built was already washing away below her. For the first time in months, I felt something close to calm. I had done everything I could to warn them. The storm was no longer my burden to carry. The water would finish what pride began. As I drove home, the thunder softened, and the world dimmed into a blur of rain and reflection. The flood had started, and there was no going back. Lightning ripped through the sky in a blinding flash, splitting the darkness into jagged white light as I reached the dam. The rain was relentless now, thick and heavy, turning every breath into steam and every step into a struggle. My flashlight flickered against the concrete walls, revealing the deep scars that lined the surface like veins of warning. The metal gate at the top moaned as the wind tore through it, the sound long and mournful, as if the dam itself remembered being strong once. The water had risen to a terrifying height, higher than I had ever seen it before, the surface swirling with foam and debris, pressing against the barrier that kept the neighborhood alive. I felt the vibration through my boots, the pulse of nature growing impatient. It was no longer a question of if but when. I climbed the slippery steps to the control platform, gripping the rusted railings as the storm tried to pull me down. My fingers ached from the cold, but I held on. The gate mechanism loomed before me, stiff from years of neglect. It creaked when I touched it, the echo vanishing into the thunder above. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the black mass of water below. The surface was restless, alive, carrying the weight of years of warning ignored. I didn't come to destroy anything. I came to release what was already inevitable. Nature had decided, and I was simply the hand that would guide it. I turned the wheel slowly, the metal shrieking in protest, until I felt the gate shift. The sound that followed was beyond human comprehension. It began as a deep groan, then erupted into a roar that filled every corner of the storm. The water surged forward, bursting through the opening with unstoppable force. The ground beneath me trembled, and I stepped back as the spray hit my face like needles. The wind howled, thunder crashed, and the flood came alive. It wasn't chaos. It was balance. Every drop that tore through that gate carried years of silence, every wave a reminder of the warnings no one had cared to hear. The dam released its burden, and with it, mine. From the platform, I watched the water race down the slope, carving its way through the valley toward the neighborhood. The lights in the distance flickered as power lines swayed and snapped. The streets that had mocked me now shone under the rain, shimmering like rivers of consequence. For the first time, the world felt quiet to me. The noise of the storm faded into rhythm, and I could almost hear the pulse of justice beating beneath the water's roar. It wasn't anger that filled me, it was something softer, something like relief. I made my way down the embankment carefully, mud clinging to my boots, rain blurring my vision. When I reached the base, I turned to look one last time at the dam. It stood like a wounded beast, split and groaning but alive in its defiance. The gate I had turned was now shaking under the pressure, the flow growing wilder by the second. I could see fragments of debris rushing past branches, scraps of fencing, even the remnants of Linda's perfect expansion project. The water had found its path, unstoppable and pure. The storm had become the voice I had been denied for years. Driving back through the rain was like moving through another world. The headlights illuminated a landscape that no longer looked like home. The road had turned into a stream, the ditches into miniature rivers. The new development was already half submerged. Cars floated crookedly against curbs, mailboxes disappeared under the brown swirl of floodwater, and fences cracked like dry bones. The pastel houses that had been Linda's pride now glowed faintly under the lightning, their reflections distorted in the rising water. Everything she had built, every symbol of her control, was dissolving before my eyes. I parked at the edge of the street and stepped out, the water rushing around my ankles, cold and fast. The sound of the flood was deafening, but beneath it, there was peace. It was the sound of truth reclaiming space, of arrogance being washed away. I walked slowly, the rain stinging my skin, watching as the neighborhood surrendered. Windows shattered, alarms screamed, and the current dragged patio furniture and flower pots into the streets. The stormlight flashed again, revealing Linda's house on the hill, still standing proud above the chaos, her lights flickering but unbroken. It was fitting. The woman who ignored every warning was now trapped in the one structure high enough to see the destruction she had created. I imagined her there, looking out through her perfect curtains, realizing too late that the danger wasn't me, it was her refusal to listen. She had built her power on weakness, and the storm was tearing that illusion apart. I stood in the rain and felt no guilt, no sorrow, only clarity. I hadn't caused this. I had tried to stop it. I had begged them to listen, and they had laughed. Now, nature was speaking louder than all of them combined. As the flood deepened, I could see the reflection of lightning dancing on the water's surface, sharp and silver. It illuminated the wreckage in flashes, the twisted lampposts, the submerged gardens, the broken pieces of the world they had called perfect. It should have looked tragic, but it didn't. It looked honest. This was what denial always becomes when truth finally arrives. The water was not cruel. It was fair. Hours passed, though I lost all sense of time. The storm began to ease, the thunder fading into the distance. The flood slowed, settling into a heavy silence broken only by the steady drip of rain from rooftops. I walked back toward my car, drenched and trembling, the night air cooling against my skin. Behind me, the neighborhood lay in ruin, but in that ruin, there was peace. For the first time in months, no one was talking, no one was mocking, no one was pretending to be in control. The water had silenced everything. When I finally reached home, the lights flickered and held. I took off my wet coat and stood at the window, watching the rain slow to a gentle drizzle. The dam was far away now, but I could still hear the faint echo of water moving, a sound that felt like release. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, the smell of rain filling the air. For once, the world had listened to me, even if it took thunder to make it happen. Linda had her empire, her rules, her board meetings, and her endless pride. But in the end, it was the storm that had the final word. And it spoke with water. By sunrise, the storm had retreated, leaving behind a landscape stripped of its perfection. The neighborhood was unrecognizable. The streets that once shimmered with morning dew were now rivers of mud and ruin. Trees leaned at awkward angles, fences lay twisted and broken, and the pastel houses that had once looked identical now sagged beneath the weight of water and shame. Pieces of furniture floated by like ghosts of a life too fragile to withstand truth. The silence was unsettling, a kind of stillness that only comes after nature has finished speaking. I stood at my window, the smell of wet earth thick in the air, watching neighbors stumble through the wreckage in disbelief. No one said my name, but every eye found me eventually. It wasn't accusation I saw. It was recognition. Linda stood on her porch, or what was left of it, her perfect white suit drenched and clinging to her skin. Her hair hung in tangled strands, her mascara running down her face in black rivers. The woman who once controlled every inch of this community looked smaller now, her clipboard gone, her confidence drowned beneath the same water she swore could never rise this high. I could see the shock in her eyes, that moment when pride collapses under truth. She didn't look at me directly, but I knew she wanted to. She wanted to find someone to blame, to restore the illusion that everything had been under her control. But the flood had stolen her voice. The silence belonged to me now. Reporters arrived before noon, cameras glinting under the grey light, their voices soft but eager. They called it a natural disaster, a once-in-a-lifetime event that no one could have predicted. I almost laughed at that. I watched them interview neighbors who stumbled over their words, speaking of safety, of shock, of loss. When one of the reporters asked if anyone had raised concerns about the dam before the storm, no one answered at first. Then one man pointed toward my house. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the still air. She warned us. She told them it would happen. For a moment, every head turned in my direction. I didn't move. I simply watched the reporter's expression shift from curiosity to realization. Justice had finally found its way through the wreckage. When the investigation began, the truth came out fast. Years of neglected maintenance, missing inspections, budget mismanagement, all buried under HOA paperwork stamped with Linda's signature. My reports were there too, every photo, every message ignored. The state called it administrative failure. I called it justice delayed. The board resigned one by one, their polite statements drowned out by the evidence. The HOA was dissolved within weeks. Linda packed what was left of her life into a moving truck and left quietly, her name erased from the neighborhood website she once ruled. I stayed. The silence that followed wasn't loneliness. It was peace. The water receded, the mud dried, and wildflowers began to bloom where manicured lawns once stood. The air felt different now, lighter, freer, untouched by her control. Every time it rained, I would stand on my porch and listen to the steady rhythm against the roof, the song of truth that had taken so long to be heard. The storm had destroyed everything she built, but it had restored something far more precious: balance. And in that balance, I found my voice again. Weeks passed before the earth began to breathe again. The smell of mud and rain lingered long after the last puddles dried, clinging to the air like a reminder that nothing built on pride lasts forever. I walked slowly through the neighborhood one morning, my boots sinking into the damp soil that had once been paved driveways and perfect lawns. The silence was heavier than the storm itself. No humming of lawnmowers, no chatter from the porches, no sound of children playing in the cul-de-sacs that had once been so carefully patrolled by rules. Only the distant whisper of the wind brushing over broken fences and collapsed sheds. The world looked raw and honest, stripped of its polish, and for the first time, I saw the place as it truly was, a canvas nature had wiped clean. The houses that remained stood scarred but upright, their walls streaked with the stains of water and time. Some families had already left, their windows boarded, their driveways empty. Others stayed, quieter now, their eyes softer, their voices lower when they greeted me. No one spoke of Linda anymore. Her name had faded from every mouth like a secret too bitter to repeat. Her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. The community she tried to shape into perfection now grew wild around the edges, and it suited it. The order she had forced upon everyone had drowned with her authority, and in its place, something gentler had taken root. I could feel it in the way the mornings smelled fresher, in the way people began to plant flowers without waiting for permission. I spent my days tending to the land that bordered the old dam. The ground there was uneven now, soft underfoot, but it was fertile. I cleared the debris, dug into the soil, and planted new flowers on the edge of my yard, bright yellow, just the way she used to hate. Each blossom felt like a quiet victory, a living symbol of defiance blooming over the ruins of arrogance. As the days passed, the flowers began to spread, their color reflecting the light with a kind of stubborn joy. I watered them carefully, not out of sentiment, but because life deserved to continue. Sometimes, in the evenings, I would stand by my window as the rain returned, light and steady, tapping against the glass like a familiar visitor. I listened not with fear but with peace. The sound no longer carried warnings, it carried memory. The storm had not punished me, it had set me free. I thought of all the times my voice had been dismissed, all the laughter, all the eyes that looked through me, and I realized that vindication does not always come with applause. Sometimes it comes in silence, in the soft patter of rain over new life. The HOA had ignored every warning, every plea, every truth that could have saved them. In the end, it was not anger that brought balance. It was nature itself, patient and unyielding, reclaiming what arrogance had borrowed for too long. Now, when the clouds gather and the first drops fall, I smile and let the sound fill the room. The water no longer drowns voices. It carries them. It carries mine.